this is Kate at the Library of Whispers. Today I thought we'd take a look at my vintage knowledge magazine series, or some of the magazines anyway. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's a colour magazine, and they were produced, I think, in the 1960s. And this is number 84, 85, 86 and 87. And I was taking a look through them, and I noticed that some of them have sort of a series of articles which follow on from one magazine to the other. And this one, in these particular editions, was about the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, that is, of course. And I'm a big fan of ships and history of well, the Navy and ships and sailing and pirates and all that kind of thing. So I thought that illustration was lovely on the front cover. It says, "The Mariner's Mirror." So let's start from the beginning. Look at that, isn't that great? Start with the first part of the article, which is in this magazine, number 84. So, in the Navy, part 1. Now, just before I start, remember that these are very old articles, and so the information is often out of date, and often the language used and the way they describe things is very old-fashioned as well. So it starts off with an illustration of Welsh Coracle. It says it's still used for salmon fishing. There is no record of the first boat. Many thousands of years ago, primitive man must have taken to the water, supporting himself on a bundle of reeds or on a gourd or on the branch of a tree. This earliest form of boat helped him to cross a stream or to find food by fishing. It was very much later that he learned to make a raft, to hollow out a tree trunk into a canoe, and to build a simple boat. One early boat was a wicker basket made watertight by covering it ships were long and lightly built and were rowed by many oars. They could easily be pulled ashore, whereas the merchant ships were more heavily built and relied principally on their sails. Okay, so these aren't Greek ships. This is a sea fight in the Middle Ages, about 1350. So it's just something different. So this here instead, this is the Greek War Galley, painted on a cup dating from about 500 BC. The Vikings. The ship took longer to develop in northern European waters. The early skin-covered boats and dugout canoes were followed by planked long ships, very strongly built, which could be rowed or sailed, and yet were light enough to be hauled up on the beach at night. The famous Viking ships were of this type. Examples of these have been found buried in the earth, where they formed graves for the dead. The Viking ships were broad, open boats over 70 feet in length. The fierce seamen from what is now Norway and Sweden raided the coasts of Britain and Western Europe between AD 700 and AD 1000. Vikings settled in Normandy, and before William the Conqueror crossed to England with his army in 1066, he first built a fleet of Viking ships. There's William the Conqueror's ship. These can be seen in the Bayeux Tapestry. They had high ends and were steered by a single oar lashed to the right or starboard side of the pointed stern. The bow and stern were alike. Ships in British and European waters during the Middle Ages followed the same pattern. They were double-ended and had a single square sail hoisted on a mast, stepped amidships. As the skill of the shipwrights improved, these ships slowly... Right, the rest of it's on the back. Or is it on the... Ah, there we go. Slowly got bigger. Platforms known as castles were built at either end. The fore and after castles. At first these castles were only used in times of war, but then cabins were fitted underneath them and they were retained in peacetime. So up here we have the Galleon Ark Royal, the flagship of the English fleet which fought the Spanish Armada in 1588. Sometime after AD 1300, a rudder of modern form, hinged to the stern post and moved by a tiller, began to replace the steering oar fitted to the ship's starboard quarter. Northern ships were clinker-built, that is, the planks overlapped each other, the upper over the lower, and were riveted together by iron nails. Small boats, such as dinghies, are often clinker-built even today. These northern ships, or cogs, traded as far as the Mediterranean. There, the typical sailing ship had given up the square sail of Roman times. Instead, the triangular lateen or Latin sail was in general use. A southern ship had two masts, each carrying a lateen sail, the larger sail being on the foremast, and it was steered by two steering oars, one on each quarter. In the 15th century, there was a surprising advance in the development of the ship. The carrack appeared, probably in the Mediterranean, although it soon became the common type of big ship from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. Instead of the single mast of the north or the two masts of the south, ships now had 3 or 4 masts and a bowsprit, and carried a complicated suit of sails. These included courses, topsails, generally Coral built Mediterranean fashion, that is, the planking was fitted edge to edge with no overlapping. Carracks were usually of some 200 tons in burden, carrying capacity, but warships built by the state, such as Henry VIII's Great Harry, could be as large as 1,000 tons. When ships first carried guns, they were fired over the gunwale, top of the ship's side, but in the 16th century the heavier guns were usually mounted between decks and fired through gunports cut in the ship's side. Most merchant ships were armed against pirates, and warships began to carry a heavy armament, which was mounted in ranks along the gun decks. In the Mediterranean, the galley maintained its prestige as the favoured warship. In battle, it was manoeuvred under oars, but it also had a lateen sail for cruising. The Portuguese were the first to build a sailing warship, which was longer in proportion to its beam width, and which had the galley's low, long beak head, rather than the overhanging forecastle of the carrack. This new type of ship was called a galleon and had a powerful broadside armament, and that is the way that the guns were mounted in a galley meant that they could only fire ahead. Okay, let's just go back to the pictures. So, let me show you a bit closer. So that picture is the Resolution, Charles II's warship of 1677 with lower sails set in heavy weather. And then this picture, merchant ship and a galley of the middle of the 15th century, from paintings by Bruegel. Okay, let's carry on. The new galleon sailed faster and was a better seaboat than the carrack, but it did not carry so much cargo. This type of ship was soon adopted by all the navies of Europe, and the Ark Royal, the English flagship, which fought against the Spanish Armada, was a galleon carrying her big guns on two decks. For 2 centuries, there were few changes in the development of ships. For example, if Nelson and Drake had exchanged ships, neither would have been much at a loss. During the 17th century, ships increased in size but became 3-masted. The bigger ships also carried a smaller mast. The sprit sail topmast, which was stepped at the end of the bowsprit, and which carried a sail called the sprit sail topsail. Formerly, sail was reduced by unlacing a strip of canvas called the bonnet, which was tied to the foot of the sail. By the middle of the 17th century, reef points, by which the sail could be reduced by tying a portion of it under the yard, began to replace the bonnets. So, what pictures do we have? We have, this is the Royal Dockyard at Deptford in the 18th century, with a warship of 100 guns in dock. Then down here we have HMS Triton, a frigate carrying 32 guns. And this one is inches work scratched by a sailor on a piece of whalebone. Then, on the top here we have the Kent, a merchant steamer built in 1876, and below that we have the Red Jacket, an American clipper ship famous for her speed. Up and down the coasts of Britain were many partly sheltered beaches where small ships could dry out on the sands at low water, and their cargoes could be uploaded into carts. Ships would often anchor in the shelter of headlands, waiting for the tide to change. During the 18th century, large fleets of Indiamen and all types of ocean-going merchant ships could be seen sheltering off Deal in Kent, waiting for the change of wind, which would enable them to start their long voyages favourably. It could be a very long business, beating or tacking out of the English Channel against headwinds. That's winds blowing from directly ahead. Introduction of steam. When the steam engine was invented, it was natural to think of using such an engine in a ship to drive some form of paddle wheel, but it needed the discoveries of the engineer James Watt, 1736 to 1819, to make the steam engine both reliable enough and convenient enough to fit a ship's hull. The first steamboats were designed for river transport and were soon being used as tugboats. In 1807, the Clermont, designed by Robert Fulton, with a steam engine supplied from Britain by Bolton, Watt and Company, was in service on the River Hudson between New York and Albany. In Europe, the first steamer to run commercially was the Comet, built on the Clyde in 1812. The first iron-hulled steamboat was the Ornamentation, built in Britain in 1822 and sent across the Channel to France for service on the River Seine. Early steamboats were regarded as being both dangerous and unreliable, and the passengers' fears were often justified. In his book, The Bible in Spain, 1842, George Barrow describes his experiences in a paddle steamer off Cape Finisterre in a gale. We were exerting ourselves to the utmost to weather the cape, which we could descry on our lee, when suddenly, with a great crash, the engine broke and the paddles on which depended our lives ceased to play. Burroughs' steamer was saved by a change of wind, which drove her safely but helplessly out to sea, instead of onto the rocks. But many disasters overtook the early steamships. The old-fashioned wooden sailing ships, efficient and safe nice and